that, we've got Michael Jeffner here. He's a long-term resident of Arlington, retired federal employee, avid amateur historian, and a reenactor in Company B, 54th Massachusetts, which was the regiment featured in the movie Glory. He was a keynote speaker at the rededication of Arlington's Fort Ethan Allen in 2014, has given presentations to numerous Civil War audiences and commemorations, even conducting battlefield tours for foreign officials. He's currently researching the history of the 2nd United States Colored Infantry, organized in Arlington for plans to write a history of this regiment. Is that the pressure on now? All right, so please welcome Michael.
Thanks very much. Is everybody good? Everybody feel good tonight? Because I went out this morning. I quit cigarettes like 25 years ago, and I felt like I did half a pack just getting the newspaper. So that was bad. So tonight we're going to talk about convalescent camp. And if you know something about the Civil War in the area, you'll also have seen references to a camp of distribution. And often we have questions of, were they the same? Were they in the same place? Did they switch places? What's going on there? And if you have to leave early, I'll clue you in. The answer to that question is complicated, but basically, don't tell anyone else who's not leaving early. Yes. So by way of introduction, much of the first Civil War or first year of the Civil War was spent in organization, right? You're raising new regiments, and you're trying to find staffs at all these levels, brigade, division, corps. It's unprecedented. I think the army that went into Mexico was like 15,000 men, maybe. At the beginning of the Civil War, it was 16,000. Now we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people, some of whom know what they're doing, most do not. And so the little questions got pushed aside for a while. Like, what do you do with men who've been sent to the hospital because they're sick or wounded, and they get better, but they're not really up to 15 miles a day on hardtack and salt pork? What happens to them? And like many questions confronting the government, this goes entirely unanswered until it has to be. By the time you get to the fall of 1862, about a year and a half into it, Washington has 70,000 troops in the defenses. Not all of them are associated with their commands, and some of them have disappeared almost entirely. One of my favorite examples, the 1st District of Columbia Volunteers. By the time they got to Antietam, their commander said, other than the colonel and adjutant, they'd entirely disappeared from sickness and desertion. John Tooley and I always wanted to portray that regiment at a reenactment of Antietam. Just show up as the colonel and the adjutant. He could be the colonel, and people would say, what unit are you? 1st DC Volunteers. Where's your regiment? We're the 1st DC Volunteers. But eventually, like September 3rd, I think, was the break point. A group of stragglers hanging around town broke into the commissary stores at Alexandria and emptied them. And finally, General Heintzelman, who was commander of the military department of Washington at the time, says, we have to do something about this. That some arrangements must be made to collect all the stragglers and convalescents who are now wandering about Alexandria and Washington, unable to rejoin their regiments, and keep them together until an opportunity offers to send them back to their regiments. So they did. They put like 10 to 15,000 guys in a camp at the foot of Shooter's Hill, which I think that's one of the Masonic temple, right, in Alexandria. Not a good place to have a camp. By the time they got set up, it was flooding, it was muddy. One of the men who was there, iPad entered the waiting room, admit, just, okay, thank you. I wanted your permission. I could take a vote on this. So it's a miserable situation. Somebody from the United States Sanitary Commission calls it a perfect Golgotha. One of the soldiers has the misfortune to be there, says the tents are carpeted with mud nearly as deep as outside, no straw, no fuel, no fire. Many of the men went wandering off from this camp, no surprise. But it's right next to Washington. So it's not like you can hide this mess. And soon you have the Committee for Investigation of the War, it gets involved. You know, the Amy Bradley of the Sanitary Commission, many other notables make noise about it. The Provost Marshal General reacts, McClellan reacts, and they finally get together teams of doctors, move them down there, start going through this mass of guys and sorting them out. Who needs to go back to the hospital? Who can go off to the front? And who do we have to find a place for? And the biggest change occurs in December of 1863, when they decide Arlington is a much nicer place to have this camp. And I think most of you here find Arlington a much nicer place to be. Especially if your housing is going to be built for you. If I can find the next page here. All right. So the new convalescent camp, high ground behind Fort Barnard, which tells most people absolutely nothing, but it's basically a bit northeast of where the WNOD crosses 4 Mile Run. So the camp that they're about to build is going to heavily overlap Green Valley and the Army and Navy Country Club. And we can see from the photos here that it's not too bad. There's still a lot of trees. When I was growing up, they told me the Yankees cut down all the trees because that's the way they were, but you know, for fuel and forts and things. But actually, if you look at maps of Arlington in 1861 and then 1865, you find out that most of the lumber and firewood is being sent from outside the area. And that shows in these photos. The bottom one is the headquarters of the Sanitary Commission. Top one, you can just see some of the barracks. So by the March 1863, they pretty much got a semi-permanent camp set up, buildings instead of tents. The tents they have are Sibleys, they're like teepees that have 15 guys in them, but they're floored and they've got heat. So you've got hospital wards, kitchens, reservoirs. The bakery can pump out 16,000 loaves a day if they have to. There's a barber shop, which is nice. The library has 6,000 volumes. So they've got a pretty good thing going. Still, the government is so hard up for troops that soon they're going to set up an organization of guys who aren't well enough to go back to their units at the front, but can still perform certain military duties. We're going to do that 2 slides from now. But first, I want to show you, that's a map of the camp. Can everyone read the writing on the right? No. I can't either here. But you'll see off to the side, all right, there's a wood lot. If you go straight up from where, actually that dirt road, that big dirt road is Glebe Road. So if you go straight up from Glebe Road and the WNOD, which is actually at this point, the Alexandria, Loudon and Hampshire Railroad, much nicer sound. You'll see a wood lot. There's a parole camp and tents just to the left of the creek. That's for guys who are prisoners who've been released by the Confederates, but they can't go back and fight until there's been a formal exchange. Other tents just to the right of the road are the distribution camp in its first iteration, guys waiting for escorts to go back to the front. And then all the buildings are barracks. And by the time everything is set up, yeah, those barracks can hold 5,000 men. Every one of those buildings is meant for a company of 100 guys. Later in the war, the quartermaster department will make them 2-story and they'll hold 200 men each. Not these, but other barracks they build in the forts in the area. The hospital wards are up just to the upper left of the barracks. The tents can hold 3,500 men. So everything combined, the enlisted quarters, the tonnage, the officers' quarters, you're looking at space for about 9,000 men. And this is probably about a mile south of Freedman's Village. All right. So the intermediate men, the ones who can't be held and they can't be sent back, they offer a new option. You can join the Invalid Corps. Those people get better, but not well enough for the front. It's a new name, a new uniform. They've got a pretty light blue chasseur jacket. They divide them into two groups. The first battalion, people who can garrison a fort, military police, break up brawls, break up brothels, break up brawls and brothels, round up deserters, enforce the draft. That becomes an important function. Second battalion, watchmen, hospital attendants, clerks. There are guys in the second battalion who are missing a leg or an arm. The Sanitary Commission and the Army start doing things like teaching people left-handed writing, and they start contests for it. The idea being that a man may be crippled for manual labor, but he's going to be able to get a good job once he's released from the Army. And eventually thousands, oh, there's another person coming in. Okay. Thousands are moved out from the convalescent camp into the Invalid Corps. And the men don't like the name and they don't like the jacket. The name, it's not so much the fact they're being called invalids because they don't want to go to the front either, but it's the initials IC. In those days, if you had a form for inspecting property and you wanted to divide the stuff that's still good from the stuff that's condemned, you would write for the latter, IC, inspected condemned, which is the same acronym they have, which leads everyone to start calling them condemned Yanks, which is kind of funny, but they weren't laughing. The other thing is a light blue jacket. Thank you for telling all the active duty soldiers that we get to stay safe in the rear with the gear. They hated being identified as rear echelon. Alfred Ballard, one of the members, talks about putting on his old Corps badge before going out on a pass, and the officer makes him take it off. That's not part of your uniform, but it's like he wanted to signal to other soldiers that he was in the Invalid Corps because he had been where they were. Yeah, the one advantage of it, though, is you continue to receive the same pay as an active duty soldier and hopefully not be sent anywhere where you're going to be shot. At the end of the first year of operations, 117,000 men have cycled through this camp. 98,000 have been returned to their regiments. That's basically Meade's army worth of men. 15,000 have been discharged or sent back to the hospital. 31,000 have been processed through from being on leave or furlough. You do have 260 deaths, which is pretty low for a Civil War camp. And by this time, the camp population has fallen from 10 to 15,000 men down to less than 2,000. And yeah, the photos show a couple of the buildings. In the upper right, you have officers' quarters, which is obvious because everyone's dressed as an officer and they got their family there, and they've got these lovely little flourishes on the outside of the barracks. Below, I think that where you have the enlisted personnel is one of the dispensaries. Everybody looks pretty mellow, maybe just got their laudanum. All right. By 1864, so many of the convalescents have been reclassified and dealt with one way or the other that it is now the rendezvous of distribution. So Camp Convalescent and the distribution camp are the same camp, and they're in the same place once they move to Arlington. The population remains less than 2,000. They start putting out a newspaper, which you can actually find on the Library of Congress site, all the issues. It comes out weekly, and it's got great tidbits about, you know, who's going where and what's going on in camp, what's going on in the city. some poems, some stories. It's a great publication. All the sales benefit an orphanage for the children of deceased soldiers. One mystery to me up until a few weeks ago, when I was looking through my records on the Second United States Colored Troops for an entirely different reason, I never knew, was this camp integrated? Were the Black troops all somewhere else? Because they had a training camp very close by called Camp Casey, where 2 regiments were organized and sent off to the war. Arlington's 2 regiments in the Civil War were African-American soldiers, in case you hadn't heard. But the camp also handled USCT. So we had this letter that I found saying, it's basically Lieutenant Freeman, AAQM, camp distribution, that's acting assistant quartermaster for you who aren't into 19th century military acronyms. And it's a receipt. I have the honor to acknowledge receipt of a clothing account for this soldier who was returned to the 2nd USCT, which is then Fort Taylor, Key West from Washington. And we even able to find out who the man was. It says James Hampton, but it was actually James Hatton, Company C, company of Washington area volunteers. He'd enlisted in Arlington and in July 1863, age 19, a waiter from the district, born in Norfolk. And unfortunately, 3 months after this receipt is written, he's going to die in the General Hospital of Key West of consumption. And I don't know what that says about the medical inspections, but the bureaucracy was working full power. All right. Part 2 of the Invalid Corps, meanwhile, in 1864, they now have a new name starting in March. And it wasn't because the soldiers complained, because if you're in the War Department bureaucracy, really, who cares? But it's because at that point, they decided that not only will we take convalescents, we will take men who are honorably discharged, who are still able, fit for duty, but would rather do this than go back to the front line. So they now accept honorably discharged men. They're a key part of the Washington garrison. I think it's in March 1864, General Grant takes 18,000 trained heavy artillerists out of the garrison of Washington, because of course, Washington's never going to be attacked. And he takes them into the service of the Army of the Potomac, where they have many bad days. So the main garrison, the backbone of the garrison of Washington, becomes the Veteran Reserve Corps. There's a lot of work going on. All the convalescents who are returned to the front are escorted by armed men, so they don't get lost on the way. All the Confederate prisoners being sent back from the front are escorted by these guys. Same reason, don't want them to get lost. There's such a high demand for their services, even 2nd Battalion troops, who, as I told you, are not really fit for field service, are pressed into duty. And probably the high point in the history of the Veteran Reserve Corps takes place on June 20th, 1864. I have to mention these guys. 18th Regiment Veteran Reserve Corps, all 2nd Battalion men. Some of them have bad backs. They can't carry their cartridge boxes. So they ask them how many cartridges they can carry loose in their pocket. Some of them are on wooden legs. You got the idea. What happens is that on that particular day, Wade Hampton, Confederate Major General, has slipped behind the Federal Army with a brigade of crack cavalrymen, 2,500 strong, and is now approaching White House Landing, which is a major depot for the Army of the Potomac. Lots of good stuff for the rebels, lots of stuff the federal government doesn't want to lose. There are only 1,000 men guarding it. So Colonel Johnson of the 18th VRC and his men volunteer to stay and defend the landing. And General Abercrombie commanding is happy to have the assistance, but he's not quite sure these are the guys he needs. So the story is, as they take their position along the line, he sends a staff officer to Colonel Johnson and says, "Will your men hold? Will they stand?" And Johnson said, "Yes, we'll do our duty." Half hour later, as Wade Hampton is closer and the firing is breaking out, it's like, "Are you certain? Will your men stand? They won't run, will they?" And Colonel Johnson says, "Please tell the general my men are cripples. They can't run." And by God, they stayed. And it was a good battle because not many people were hurt on one side or on either side. But there was a guy wounded in the 18th VRC, and reenactors and amateur military historians, of which I am both, often talk about their favorite regiments. Who's your favorite regiment? It's always somebody who was on Little Round Top or the midst of fighting at the Second Bull Run or something. It's like, older I get, the more it's like 18th VRC, hands down. Yeah. The last people who should have been there, last people who wanted to be there, but by God, they were there. Which leads us directly into, if I can find the right key, the Battle of Washington. So remember, Grant has taken away all the trained garrison. So when Early shows up at the gates of Washington, there's about 36 hours in which the only people who are facing off against him are new artillery companies in the forts. Troops have been raised, I think, over the winter. So they're not exactly experienced soldiers. The most experienced soldiers are the Veteran Reserve Corps, but they call out everyone. And you know, if you have to take obsolete muskets and put them in the hands of civil servants and ask them to defend your nation's capital, you might just be looking at a bad day. And if you're one of those office workers who gets a musket and has to march 5 miles to the front at Fort Stevens, you're never going to complain about a bad day at the office again. And fortunately, these guys are ready. By the way, 5 miles in 97-degree heat. That may have had as much to do with General Early not taking the city as anything. But one of the guys who was in the quartermaster department was named James Singer, ex-19th United States Infantry, said, as they go into the line under fire, he said, he and his fellows, we about as politely informed them that we were at home and prepared to receive callers. Another guy, Alfred Apted, a company called the Brady Sharpshooters attached to 16th Michigan, said he was walking wounded out of Lincoln Hospital. He said, if the Reds do come, which I do not think they will be foolish enough, but if they do, we will give a good account of ourselves. So the last people you would want to be in the most important place in the world to defend, they gave a good account of themselves. And I want to say probably the happiest person in all of this was the guy commanding all the provisional troops, and that was Quartermaster General Montgomery Meigs, because he wanted the whole war to get off and actually participate in the fighting. But he was a really crack quartermaster general and probably one of the generals most responsible for the United States beating down the slaveholders' rebellion. So they kept him in Washington, but now he had his chance. He had his own division. And I don't usually like reading general orders, but I'll make an exception for General Meigs. I'm very happy. General Orders number 2. And the second half, Brevet Major General Meigs, commanding the division, takes this opportunity to thank the soldiers and civilians of the Quartermaster's Department for the alacrity and zeal with which they have organized and moved to defend the capital, insulted by traitors. The rebel army under tried and skillful leaders has looked at and felt of the northern defenses of Washington. These looked ugly and felt hard. They left their dead unburied and many of their wounded on the way by which they retired. They will not soon again insult the majesty of a free people in their nation's capital. Not until January 6th, and hopefully never again. So you may have noticed I mentioned convalescents who weren't actually from the camp of distribution. When all the smoke had cleared, they found out that there were thousands of guys who were just hanging out at the general hospitals who had not been sent on to the camp of distribution, much less to the front. So suddenly, command came from, I guess it was Major General Alger commanding the department at that point. It's like, round these guys up and sort them out and send them where they ought to be. And the comment in the Soldier's Journal was, at no time has it been so completely jammed as at present. So that's July 1864. Took weeks to clear the backlog, but in good time, they were down to what they had been before, about 2,000 men. And finally, things quieted down. So even before the last campaign of the war, February of 1865, the functions were transferred to Soldiers' Rest, which was a big soldiers' hostel in Alexandria, and all the buildings were turned over to the medical department. And the last issue comes out of the Soldier's Journal, comes out in June 65, from what they've now called Alger General Hospital. And I do make mistakes. And I had written up a paper for Friends on camp distribution and camp convalescence that got, I guess it's now on the blog of the National Museum for Civil War Medicine. And at this point in the narrative, I say, and then in a few months, everything was auctioned off with all the other government property that was auctioned off at the end of the war. All the forts in the area, with the exception of very few, the quartermaster department took them over, put them up for public auction. You can read the ads in the papers of the time, very interesting. All those forts had wooden backups to the ramparts, wooden gun platforms, usually buildings inside of them, hospitals, barracks. Those all got sold off for secondhand lumber. And outside the forts, you had abatis or abattis, depending on how you want to pronounce it, but it's basically felled trees with the branches sharpened. And that's your mid-19th century form of barbed wire. That got sold off for firewood. Camp Casey, speaking of my favorite regiment, 2nd United States Colored Infantry out of Arlington, when they were at Camp Casey, they were intense. But as soon as they left, and the 23rd United States Colored Troops started raising, they built barracks. The 2nd came back from Florida in January 1866. All the buildings, all the nice buildings in Camp Casey had been auctioned off in August. So they never did see Camp Casey when it was an actual camp. Fortunately, they weren't in Alexandria long. They got paid off. I think it was like $250,000 among the regiment. So big injection of cash into the domestic economy of the area. All right, so what happens after the war? And I want to thank Jessica Kaplan on the board of the Historical Society for showing me a letter, when long after I thought this camp had been auctioned off, she has a letter from a gentleman at camp distribution asking the military authorities to assign a teacher, because that camp is still in use, and it's in use by the Freedmen's Bureau. And we find out that as of October of 1865, there are 1,070 people in Freedmen's Village, and there are another 8,000 African Americans designated, destitute, living in Alexandria County. So that's between the city and the county. So the population of Arlington at that point, if you think about it, that's like, at least 6,000-7,000 African Americans, mostly refugees from enslavement. They're called destitute, but rations are only being issued to a few hundred. So, the rest are not living on air. They obviously have jobs. They're working. The only question is getting housing other than in this camp or Freedmen's Village. So that remains an active community for a few years. Yeah, we talk about in 67, they auction off the subsistence department buildings. They try to auction off 113 acres, the whole thing with all the buildings. I guess in the spring and summer of 1867, but it gets held up in court. And then you have further activities that go on. There's a teacher mentioned, Thomas Carlin, April 67, June 67, papers mention a ladies' picnic on the farm of Samuel O. Baggett, who apparently has the land, but the buildings are still there and being used. I love this. September 67, Colored Radical League meets. There are also religious camp meetings held. September 68, there's mention of the debris of the once great camp being removed, but that's the same date that Levy Jones applies for a teacher for 50 students. And this continues at least until 1870, only now they're calling it Camp Distribution Freedmen's Village. There's one more thing going on here in the immediate post-war era. I mentioned 2 black regiments being raised in Arlington during the Civil War. Right after the Civil War, there's another regiment being raised, the 40th United States Army, no longer colored troops, but regular soldiers of the United States Army. At this time, I think the Army has decided to recruit 4 regiments, black regiments of infantry, and maybe another 4 of cavalry. In 1870, that'll get knocked down to 2 regiments each, and the 30th or 40th United States Infantry will be amalgamated into the 25th, which goes on to have a life as a black unit right up until Truman integrates the Army in 46, and then continues till 57 integrated. The first colonel is Nelson A. Miles, which if you're a student of the Indian Wars, is a very prominent name. He shows up as, eventually becomes the Chief of Staff of the United States Army. I remember him most as the officer who tried to get the guy in command at Wounded Knee court-martialed and was not successful. The sergeant on the right, unfortunately, I do not have an identity for. This is actually a U.S. uniform of the 1880s. I don't have a picture of a soldier in the 40th, but he's in the 25th. But I have to mention before I leave them, great regiment, highly disciplined, but while they were here, sometimes the young men got passes into town and got riotously drunk. So there's an article from the Alexandria Gazette, September 28th, 1866, that talks about a group of these men throwing stones at a passing train on the Loudon and Hampshire Railroad, which stops, they're arrested. Obviously, they're drunk, they let themselves get arrested, and they're taken to the Hoosgow in Washington. And the article ends saying, their conduct while on the cars and in the watch house was outrageous. The language they used and the songs they sung being horribly obscene. Now, say what you want about Civil War music. I'm saying the jumpy tunes that led into this keep reminding me that reenactors and historians are much more enthusiastic about the war than the guys who actually had to fight it. But I would love to get the words and music for these songs. I think if Ken Burns had used them in his documentary instead of that soupy saccharine Ashokan farewell, we would all have a much greater, profounder appreciation of what Civil War soldiers were actually like. But alas, it is lost to history. I got one last thing to say. I actually kept to this pretty well. Oh, so we'll have lots of time for questions, but the overall subject is kind of grim because we're talking about hospitals, we're talking about casualties, we're talking about invalids in uniform who are still being used as active soldiers. So the lightness of tone does not really respect it. And in my defense, I want to say that certain bits of the humor inspected, condemned Yanks, my men are cripples, actually come from the official history of the Veteran Reserve Corps, which was written by a man named John William DeForest, who was one of the three great writers of the 19th Corps, which is much more of a compliment than it might appear. And after the war, he wrote a series of articles for the, I believe it was a Century magazine, that or the Atlantic, about his experiences. There's one on forced marches, which if you've ever wondered what it took out of somebody to cover 40 miles on foot and those or 30 miles on foot and those kinds of shoes with that uniform in the heat of Louisiana summer, it's a good article. And it also explains why he himself was writing the history of the VRC, and it's because that's where he ended up after those marches and the fighting he saw. And he was a veteran of whom someone once asked one of the worst questions you can ask a veteran. They said, "Did you like it?" And he said, "Certain military authors who have never heard a bullet whistle have written copiously for the Marines to the general effect that fighting is delightful. It is not. It is just tolerable. You can put up with it, but you can't honestly praise it. Baiting a few flashes of elation, which come in moments of triumph or in the height of a breathless charge, when the air is all a yell and the earth is all aflame, it is much like being in a rich cholera district in the height of the season." And that picture, by the way, also has an Arlington connection. The men in the background are quartermaster department employees. They're actually in uniform. They have weapons nearby. They were sent during the war to go around to some of the battlefields and dig up the bodies that had been hastily buried and send those United States soldiers back here to Arlington. So that, as much as the camp, is a part of our history. And thank you very much for listening. Okay, question time. Told you everything you want to know, right? Oh, okay, you.
Yes, last semester in college, I wrote a paper on the symbolism of chain bridge, and I briefly touched on chain bridge's impact in the Civil War. And I was wondering if there was more I hadn't seen, like, were there any battles or sabotage missions near there?
Briefly, no. Not that they weren't prepared for that. I don't know if you've seen photos of the time. There are blockhouses there. It's very close to Fort Marcy, so it was covered. It was an essential part of the defenses, which you probably also know from that. It hooks up not only with the roads to Washington, but the canal. And so no battles. It's kind of, it's interesting. It makes me think of another African-American regiment right after the war, Fort Marcy, Fort Ethan Allen. All of the forts south and the defenses south of the Potomac were garrisoned by the 107th United States Colored Troops out of Louisville. And the thing I like about them, they saw a lot of service towards the end of the war. But while they were here, people continued to learn to read and write. So a lot of the regiment became literate. And I told you about how overwhelmingly African-American Arlington was. And they were a favorite of the locals. And there's a newspaper note of their band playing at civic functions. So that doesn't answer your question, but I hope you like it anyway. Charlie.
Yeah, so can you talk about some of the private homes and churches that were commandeered to become hospitals,
Can I talk about some of the churches and private homes that were commandeered in Arlington? I think not much. And I'll tell you why, because the Army, as soon as it could, took people out of improvised houses and put them into, actually the medical department preferred hospital tents to enclosed buildings. They're easier to access. You can ensure ventilation. So that was one reason. And then, of course, Alexandria, you have longer lasting hospitals. But on one of the slides, I didn't go into it, but there was a design for I think a hospital ward. This camp at Camp Distribution had space for, I think, another 1,000 soldiers in their hospital wards. And these were purpose built by the quartermaster department to ensure heating and ventilation and all the services, down to storerooms for soldiers' possessions and a little dead room if somebody passed away. I will say something about that, though, that every church that I have seen in this area, well, at least two of them, Mount Olivet close to my house, and Falls Church. Falls Church has like 3 different historical markers, all giving a slightly different story of what happened to it. Mount Olivet has 3 things they highlight in their historical marker, one of which I know is true. But there's this story that they were all turned into stables for horses, cavalry horses during the war. You see this over and over again. Church was ruined, used it as a stable. I asked a cavalryman once, a reenactor, I said, okay, you've taken over a church, it's been abandoned. Who's going to sleep inside, you or your horse? This is not a hard question. And if you look at the stables that the Army purpose built, they provide for access and, you know, stalls and zinc line feed troughs so the soldiers or the horses don't eat them. And if you look at the buildings themselves, getting a horse in and out would be a problem. So I just mentioned that because you're going to go places in the South, and every church that survived the war in the South is going to have that story. I didn't think anything of Falls churches till I went to like Cross Keys, and I asked somebody when we were registering for a reenactment, so is the original church here? So, no, it's what the Yankees used it as a stable. I had a friend who swore that his church in Winchester had been used as a stable, but I've actually got Elijah Hunt Rhodes saying that he worshiped there. Elijah Hunt Rhodes was a federal officer. He would know if he was worshiping alongside horses. So again, that sort of over answers your question, but yes, sir.
On the map of the convalescent camp, it said Fairfax County. I'm wondering what if you could explain the discrepancy there.
I'm sorry, can you ask that again? Camp Lincoln and Fairfax?
On your lecture, you showed a map of the convalescent camp.
Oh, yeah.
Hey, Michael, if you could repeat the question, it might help the folks at home too.
Okay, okay, yes. Well, we're trying to get to what the question is. Thank you. So
Early on in your lecture, you put a map and it was a fit right there.
yes, it says Fairfax County because I think the city of Alexandria is located in well, trust a northerner to correctly identify it. But if you look closely at the map, we can identify exactly where it is, and it's in Arlington County. I took like I said, the real key is where does Loudon and Hampshire cross 4 Mile Run? So it's not quite clear on that, but yeah.
So what's there now?
Hmm?
Right, so what is there? What's there now?
What's there now? Yeah, it basically straddles Green Valley and the Army Navy Country Club as far as major landmarks.
So another question was, you said it was became a freedmen's village after the Civil War, is that correct?
After the war, it became housing for African Americans who were largely refugees from enslavement in the South, and it stayed that way for several years.
That was different. Yeah.
Yes, it is different. It's probably about a mile south of Freedmen's Village itself, but at some point in our history, it got conflated. And I have to say this, you know, again, given the numbers, a lot of my friends in the 54th talk about Black history as American history. So Black history is Arlington history. There is a period starting in about 1863 and going on for at least 10 or 20 years where Arlington history is Black. And one of our greatest challenges going forward, and we'll hear, I think, some more about that next month, is just getting a handle on that. That's probably the least researched aspect of our history, and how that became that way and what happened to it is something that there's work to be done. Other questions? As you know, I can make things up if I don't know the answer. Yes, ma'am.
Said that died, convalescent camps, were they buried there? Has there been any graves uncovered or cemetery?
The question is, 260 men passed away in Camp Convalescent. I mentioned it in 1863. Are they buried there? I do not know, but I think what would have happened is that those bodies would have been moved to Arlington Cemetery. You know, if the Army was sending gangs of quartermaster employees around regionally to ship people back to Arlington, that's what they would have done. And in fact, I think the first bodies that went into Arlington Cemetery were taken from many cemeteries that had been used throughout the area. So the first job of that cemetery was to consolidate the burials from the region. Yes, sir, and back.
Where was Camp Casey in relation to Clinton?
That's a great question. Where was Camp Casey in relation to Convalescent Camp? I'm going to use an approximation about a mile north. It was between Camp Convalescent, or Rendezvous of Distribution, and Freedman's Village. There is some speculation the county actually hired a historical architecture firm to, find out where Camp Casey is. Because we don't have or haven't yet found a map that shows it, we have just a description, and it's generally consistently described as being a mile and a half beyond, at the end of the long bridge from Washington, which is 14th Street Bridge, which actually gives you about a half-mile variance because of the length of the bridge and where it's supposed to end. And my feeling is that it's somewhere between the Air Force Memorial and I think Walter Reed. So somewhere in there, it's described as in the hills of Arlington. We know there was an order telling the first encampment of the 2nd USCI to move either beyond the line of fortifications or a mile in back of them. So since a mile in back of them would have put them in the Potomac or a swamp, they end up right in front of Fort Albany. So hard to describe, but if you go to the northernmost point of the Army Navy Country Club, and then a bit further to the west, so somewhere in that area. The other thing is the camp, a full camp of infantry is going to be like 400 by 400 yards. So there's not a single point there, but if we ever get a marker up, it should be somewhere in that area. Other questions? Any online questions?
We don't have any online questions, Michael.
Wonderful, wonderful. All right. One more. Yes, sir. Yes. Okay, thank you. I kind of glossed over it. United States Sanitary Commission at the Sanitary Commission. So it was like a proto Red Cross. It was an organization of civilians. Frederick Law Olmsted was one of the people behind it. And because of the horror stories that came out of the operations of the medical department in the first few months of the war, they were utterly ill-equipped for what they faced. You had this group of civilians, prominent in many cases, who got together to raise money to buy things that guys could eat in hospital, shirts, underclothes. The most important thing about them is the amount of supplies they provided to hospitals never came close to what the medical department was providing, but it was stuff the medical department didn't provide: farina, dried fruit, nice clothes that people could wear instead of scratchy issue uniforms. And they were very influential. When they raised a ruckus about the condition of the convalescent camp, it got listened to. So that's who they are. They also had a United States Christian Commission that was going at the same time. They did much less in the way of providing supplies you could use, but they did, have like coffee and donuts, and they did preach, and they did print a lot of pamphlets telling soldiers not to drink and not to smoke and not to do other things that good Christians ought not to do. And it's interesting that when bodies were being reburied at Gettysburg or excavated, the contractor was supposed to take an inventory of what was found on them in hopes that it might identify them. And there's a list of that inventory somewhere. And you get things like company brass letters in guys' pockets because it may come loose. You don't want to lose it. You get charged for it. Pens, pen knives, and a lot of pamphlets. And the question is, were soldiers really that religious, or were they serving the purpose that Axis propaganda leaflets served during the Second World War? And that's something historians cannot settle definitively, but all right. Thank you. That's right, it is. Huh?
Was it?
Man, I don't know. I actually, they have their proceedings are published. You can find them on like Google Books. And that makes interesting reading, but
because he was of prime age to serve. But Roosevelt's mother was Southern and her brothers were in the Confederate Army. And apparently she had an absolute fit over the thought of her husband and brothers shooting at each other. And so he bought a substitute and then, kind of made up for, how guilty he felt by, trying to help the sanitary conditions for Union soldiers.
they were very influential.
Yeah.
And that helped a lot.
Yeah. Oh, he was from a very wealthy family, so he would have known, they would have known him, the powers that be.
Hey, Mark, do you have any wrap-up words for the folks at home? So that,
Oh,
Nope, thank you for coming.
okay, I'll end the Zoom session.
if anybody's still on.
Yeah.
They're involved. I don't know Miles.
You want me to end the Zoom session, Mark?
Hold on just one
Okay,
minute.
Okay.
It's not easy duty. As we can tell from the discipline.
Thank you, that was I was hoping to get like an answer on that, because the amount of research you can do on an Arlington-based bridge in Pennsylvania is not.
Well, if you have, actually, if anybody has any questions, I have these cards with, it's with my email, post office box is there.
It's really informative. I was gonna ask, is there a good source like to really showing all the maps and where all the ports are?
Well, actually, there is some, the Historical Society has, I think, a copy of the 1865 map that we carry around to ask people where to find.
Okay, thank you, Marty. You can shut everything down now.
Okay, I'll end the message session.